In short, I'm a journalist, exclusive. My name is Joyce Joanne Wangui, or otherwise known as JJ. I'm a practicing journalist now for 15 years in different African countries. Rwanda, Uganda, Ethiopia, Zambia, Kenya, South Africa, Botswana, and the Netherlands, The Hague. But the reason I'm here today is to talk about the kind of stories that I write, and to talk about a particular demographic that has been forgotten. I primarily write about, the international criminal justice. I was covering the Kenyan cases at the International Criminal Court. That was, when we had those cases in the court. But I took a particular niche to be writing about sexual violence in conflicts, because I realized whenever we have conflicts or atrocity crimes, there's a category of victims or survivors that is least seen. They are not visible. These are survivors of sexual violence. And sexual violence is rape, gang rape, forcible circumcision of men, rape of children, so many, sexual violence surrounds so many violations that happen. These are gendered violations that happen to women and men, but my particular niche is during conflict. I don't want to say that violations that happen in peace times are any less, but I just took that particular niche because I remember, during the post-election violence, when we were writing these stories, there was that vigor of, sorry to use that word, we were writing about the internally displaced persons. Why? Because their violations were seen. Someone was able to say, I was uprooted from this home and displaced from my home. So you're able to show your violation. But somebody who has been raped or sexually violated has nothing to show for it. Her voice is her strength and her voice is her truth. Before I go far, just imagine one day you woke up without a voice, or at least half a day you don't have a voice. Just think about that for a minute. So I just want to talk about briefly the power and strength of voice. And I'm here to voice the strengths, even the challenges, but mostly I want to voice about the strengths that are not seen. I'm not here really to talk on behalf of survivors of sexual violence. No. I say this very clearly because everybody has a voice. This thing of saying you're speaking for the voiceless or speaking on behalf of, it can happen to children, minors, but even minors have a voice. Somebody's voice is the most powerful tool. What I do with the stories is we give them platforms to articulate their issues, but we don't tell them what to say. We are very eloquent in writing. That's a fact. We are journalists. But there is no better person who can tell the story, for instance, of a survivor of sexual violence, than the survivor herself. There is depth, there is integrity to the story, and it gives them agency. Because imagine, why I'm saying that is because when something like rape or sexual violence happens to somebody, it takes off your dignity, it takes off your honor, it also takes off your voice, it takes it away. Because sexual violence is meant to humiliate, to destroy, to do all the bad things. But then there's a time comes when that voice is regained. And what I do with my stories is I let that voice dominate. The voice of somebody who has been violated. The voice of somebody whose dignity was stripped away from her or him. Because I also write about stories of tens of hundreds of men who are raped in violence. But today we are here to talk about how women change policy, how women change the narratives. I interact and meet with survivors of sexual violence often. And sometimes you may wonder, is there anything to learn from a person who's going through a lot of adversity? There is a lot to learn. Oftentimes, and you'll agree with me, survivors of sexual violence, and I'm using the word survivors deliberately, not victims, because they have survived that violation. You can be in a victimhood state when it happens, but you survived it, and then you later even become an activist or an advocate of change. Oftentimes, their names do not sound a bell. Their faces do not even grace the magazines or newspapers. Their strengths, their fortitude is not even seen, is not recognized. Their achievements. The other day, somebody was asking me, if you are to talk about the achievements of somebody like who has been raped, what would you say? And I said, one of the achievements is the voice that she has. She has a voice to talk about what happened to her. It happened to me. We are all, remember, we are in this moment of Me Too. You all know about the Me Too moment, and time is up. The Me Too moment has sparked a debate globally to say that never again to sexual violence. You've seen so many people coming down, including the latest, R. Kelly. So many big people because of the Me Too moment. And I think we need to have a Me Too moment in Kenya, in this country, because another day, another rape. Even if I write about survivors mostly from conflict situation, switch on your television, any day, anytime, switch on your radio station, it's a defilement case. A mother has been raped, a grandmother has been raped, a child has been raped. I'll give you a short story. I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo when I was doing a series of stories of sexual violence, and I was covering a famous or infamous case called the Kavumu trial, where soldiers and militiamen had raped so many children as less as even 2-year-old, yanked from their mothers in the house and raped. And they had suffered so many violations in their bodies. Like, it took the strengths and the skills of 2018 Nobel Peace Laureate Dr. Denis Mukwege, who's been treating those young children. Imagine such a child, of course, cannot articulate. They are very young to articulate. Their mothers were so traumatized. They were telling us, I remember one woman telling me, Joyce, do you think there is hope in this country? This country has been labeled the rape capital of the world. Every day is a rape. Now they are raping our children. Do you think we can use our voices to shift the narrative? To shift the narrative that sexual violence can be done away with? To shift the narrative of men who are mostly the authors of these perpetrations. Men mostly are the perpetrators of violence. Although lately, I was reading a report the other day talking about how in a conflict situation, how women have been raping men. And I was like, wow, where are we turning to? If we haven't solved the commonplace violation, which is rape of men to women, then, where are we heading with this? Like I said, I don't want to speak for so long. We are used to behind the scenes things, writing articles and stuff. We're not used to addressing, But the power of voice, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're here to celebrate actually the International Women's Day. And I'm here standing in front of you to celebrate the achievements of so many survivors in this country. So many survivors that I've seen, so many survivors who are using their voice to prick the concerns of government and the duty bearers and to tell them, hey, recognize us. It has not been acknowledged. They haven't been recognized. There was a Restoration Justice Fund, I think 10 billion, that was mentioned by the president in his State of the Nation address in 2015, which was to go towards restoring the broken pieces of, the broken lives rather, of people who have been violated in so many ways in this country, so many ways, not just the sexual violence survivors. So we've had a litany of violations in this country, especially from 1963. That's enumerated in the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation report. A chunk of that money was given to internally displaced persons. But survivors of sexual violence were nowhere. And I can tell you for a fact, First of all, they're not recognized. You cannot compensate something that you don't acknowledge or recognize. So why we were writing these stories is to bring their violations to light. Say, you're compensating a category of people who really suffered in this country. They were internally displaced. But what about people who are sexually violated? Their lives were shattered. They're not able to move from one step to the other. They are at limbo. But then they are recognizing that the voice that they have is their truth. That voice is what they use also as testimony in court. It is so hard for somebody who's been raped to go and testify in court. Because you know the theatrics of court, the defense counsel will tear you apart. You're there, you are vulnerable, you're traumatized. Your words are not even consistent because of the trauma. That inconsistency is what the defense counsel might use to shut down your evidence. As much as we also write these stories, we encourage, for the most part, what I do as a journalist, other than writing these harrowing, grim statistics, I encourage survivors of sexual violence to speak up, be the voice of change, because it is their voice that matters. It is their voice that matters. In 1998, at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, if you all recall the Rwandan genocide, judges were looking at all other evidence apart from rape. Why? Not a single woman had stood in the witness stand to testify because of the same issue, the stereotype, the stigma, the shame, the reprisals. You fear, what about if I testify today and then by tomorrow I'm killed or my husband is killed? It took 3 powerful women's voices to testify, of course in camera, and say, it happened to me. Of course, there's the issue of evidence. Evidence is a key issue, and it has to be used. But it took their words to convince the judges. Well, the judges look at where there is no evidence. The judges look at the credibility of somebody's testimony. These women stood up, 3 of them, and they said, it's not just 3 of us who have been raped. And I'm talking of rapes, gang rapes. A woman has been raped by 10, 15 men, conceives a rape child. You're supposed to bring up that child amongst other children that you have. Those are the things you're telling a courtroom. And a courtroom that is wired to, it takes a very sensitive judge to adjudicate in favor of survivors. So other than writing the stories that I do, which are really hinged on giving voice and visibility to survivors of sexual violence, I also advocate. I'm very active on Twitter. I use my Twitter handle to advocate for justice. There cannot be peace. There cannot be peace without justice. There can never be peace without justice. But what sort of justice are we talking about? Why are we talking about justice in exclusion? Like we're excluding a category, a certain in quotes, because there's a stereotype attached to somebody who's been raped. She just stood here and spoke about the challenges of being a person living with disabilities. Sheila stood here to talk about the imbalances in the media, the lens at which women are looked at. So imagine somebody whose life has been shattered in such a gruesome manner, even being able to stand and say anything. Who will even listen to her? So today as I stand here, I celebrate their voice. For me, the International Women's Day, for me, is to celebrate the voices of survivors of sexual violence. May look suppressed now, but therefore it's a revolution. Last year in Senegal, there was a very huge case, last year but one, very, very huge case on a former dictator called Hissène Habré of Chad, but the case was held in Senegal. For over 25 years, victims and survivors of atrocity crimes, which are so many war crimes, crimes against humanity, sexual violence, again, rape. It took them 25 years, painstaking exercise, to take their dictator to court. There was a lot of pessimism surrounding that. I will admit, even me as a journalist, I was very pessimistic. I was like, for once, Africa, we are having a trial of a former heads of state. There are so many, but how will that happen? Survivors of sexual violence initially did not want to talk because they're like, nobody will believe us. That issue of believability. You have to prove so much. How do you go to court and prove that you have been raped? How? If not physical and forensic evidence, if you don't have that, it is your word against everything else. So even the kind of stories we write, and sometimes it also depends on how these stories are written. How do you project these stories? I'm trying to shift away from writing harrowing stories. It is very important to background a story, but I'm trying, in this reporting of sexual violence, I'm trying as much as possible to shift away from writing the harrowing detail, the grim detail. It's very important, but also to write stories that brand the hope message. The case in Senegal, the former dictator was convicted. He's now in jail. But it also took that powerful voice I'm talking about, of several survivors of sexual violence to even accuse the former president himself of personally raping them. And he was standing there in the dock. And by the way, that was the first case I saw where they were testifying in public court. In public. They were given all the court mechanisms to hide their faces. They were like, we are not hiding our faces. We are here to show the world that it happens to us, but we also want to encourage other women who pass through the same violations that they can come and testify, defy the shame, the stigma. The defense counsel were even calling these women all sorts of names in the courtroom, prostitutes, everything. You see, that's the stereotype also attached to somebody who has been raped. Prostitute. Which other word? Loose, slut. What were you wearing? How were you talking? It also takes us journalists, how we frame these questions. The other day, I don't want to mention the TV station, last year. It was an exclusive interview, not me, between a TV host and survivor of rape. That was rape. And some question really irked Kenyans, like Kenyans on social media were on fire. Okay, if you remember, that's it. The line, how you question. When I started writing these stories, I was just plunged in the field. There was no template, guys. I was used to doing investigative work. I've done a lot of investigative stories. There's a time I went to do a story in South Sudan. Very dicey environment, I almost lost my life. I was almost raped in South Sudan because I was writing a story about unraveling the whole issue of how girls are prostituted. When South Sudan became a nation, everyone thought, hey, I would run there, I want to invest in these and these. But also sex workers saw a niche. They're like, oh, this is a new country, the new kid on the block. So everyone was running there to have a cut of the cake. But I was looking at the intricacies surrounding prostitution and how women are lured in prostitution, forceful, the trafficking of women and girls. That's a story for another day. When I started writing stories of sexual violence, to be honest, there was no template. In journalism school, we didn't learn this. In journalism school, we learned the basics, probably until now. In our days, I'm not young, it was just the basic education of like when you're going to do a story, is there 5 W's and H? Like when you're questioning the who, the who, when, how, what, But imagine you have been sent to write a story of somebody who found themselves in a crisis, like the post-election violence. I want to draw your attention to that because that's what I've covered most. And you're there, and it's between you and that survivor. Even you have your own misconceptions because you're not trained. You're training yourself. It was very, very hard. I remember at some point I hung my boots. I'm like, I'm not cut out for this. But then I said, then who else is going to write about this? Because when I was flipping through the newspapers, very few, if any, story was about a woman who was raped in the post-election violence. That was mixed in other news. But then there was no exclusive reporting, exclusive again, on this kind of violation. And I was fortunate enough to work for an organization called Journalists for Justice that gave me a platform to start telling these stories. We initiated the reporting, the special reporting of, survivors of rape and sexual violence during the post-election violence, and it ignited a debate in this country. I remember at some point, these stories, first of all, people could not even believe. People are like, are you sure you went to talk to, are you sure you're not fabricating stories? I remember one day I was also invited in Press Pass, this I'll say. And the host asked me, how sure are you as a journalist that these women you're writing about have been raped? What proof do you have? What would you say if it were you? It was on live television. It was my first time. I was sweating my lungs out. The question caught me off guard. Because like I said, the skills and training in media are lacking. And this was my answer to him. I'm not a judge, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not there to prove that whoever is telling me their story has been raped. I'm there to take the word. I'm there to listen to them. There are people in other areas who will prove her word against everything else. But the question the host insisted, but how do you prove? Because somebody can just come and say, hey, I hear you're writing about these stories. Hey, I was also raped in the post-election, write my story. It's really a delicate balancing act. But for the most part, what I do, or what other colleagues of mine in this line of reporting do, is to uphold the dignity and the sensitivity of survivors. For the most part, you have to uphold their dignity. Remember, that dignity was stripped away from them. They are trying to regain their dignity. Are you as a journalist going to do more harm? Do no harm is one mantra that I use when I'm writing these stories. I just don't rush to write them. I do them very slowly and very calculatively, tactful. Because also you don't want, when somebody reads their story, they're like, oh my goodness, this does not represent me. Anyway, we're here on the event of the International Women's Day 2019. Really, first of all, I'm happy to be alive and to see another, how many years of existence now? I don't know for how long it has been held. And the theme was balance for better. But we can't talk about balance when there's an imbalance. First of all, there's not even, we are not recognized. Let's be honest. We're trying to bury our hands in the sand when we think about the post-election violence. Now we've had 2 post-election violences in this. Of course, the 2007 H1 is the most prominent in scale, in size, in, but also we had the 2017 post-election violence, and still women were raped and violated. And then it got me thinking, we have to write these stories. We have to tell these stories. Not because you want to keep telling the harrowing story, but also to voice their concerns. They demand justice, they demand reparations, they demand healing. Yeah? So my parting shot would be, let's embrace all survivors of atrocity crimes in this country. There are so many. There are so many. Let's embrace each other. Don't look at a survivor of rape or a survivor of anything else as that person, or look at it like it's far-fetched, it can't happen to me. In a conflict situation, or like in a terror situation, like it happened, it has been happening, anyone or everyone is a victim, potential victim. You just don't know where you are. So let's embrace the survivors. Let's show them that they should continue voicing their concerns, because one day their voice will be too loud that it will rattle, it will shake, it will just rattle the status quo. As we speak, the survivors of the post-election violence against sexual violence survivors are trying to seek audience with the head of state. They have tried to do that for 3 years now. What struck me about that seeking of audience is they wrote their own concerns. They did not invite journalists to write about their stories. They were writing them in their own language, in their own handwriting. And that is what they want to present to the head of state. Is like, Mr. Uhuru Kenyatta, we exist. These things happened to us. We bore children of rape. What is the government doing? Right now, we are all dealing with the big forward. How can you? It's okay, it's good. It's an agenda of the government. But we can't deal with that when a section of Kenyans feels let out, feels imbalanced. So I want to implore and to impress on every one of us here to embrace each other, despite what the challenges that people have gone through. Let's not be having these celebrations of the International Women's Day, but just looking at the top big things that have happened, but also looking at the people who are not seen and bring them to light. When, is it Ima or Ida? Ima was talking, I was like, wow, this is a new kind. You know, the vigor, she's, my goodness, I can't even start, I'll write about you, exclusively, yeah? When Sheila stood here and she said, most times when we talk about female journalists, we just see the glow and the glamour. She's glowing. But we don't see the effort behind that. When she stood here to speak, first thing you'll see is her that's what I saw. Is it the crutch or clutch? I'm cute, so that one. But you have to see beyond that. Very articulate young woman, very, very extremely articulate. So much to share. Change maker. Yes. So guys, thank you very much for listening to me. Let's hope to have more of these interactions, and let's embrace each and every one of us.